London, 1888. A chilling autumn descends upon the impoverished district of Whitechapel. Gas lamps flicker, casting long, dancing shadows down cobblestone alleys slick with rain and grime. A palpable fear grips the city, a terror that has a name whispered in hushed, frightened tones: Jack the Ripper. For 10 terrifying weeks, a shadowy figure stalked the East End, a phantom who emerged from the fog to commit unspeakable acts before vanishing without a trace. The killer targeted vulnerable women, leaving a trail of brutalized victims and a city paralyzed by panic. The police were baffled, the public was horrified, and the newspapers were in a frenzy, fueling the legend with sensational headlines. Despite one of the largest manhunts in London's history, the killer was never caught. The case went cold, but the mystery only grew, becoming the world's most infamous unsolved crime. Over the decades, countless theories have emerged, and more than 100 individuals have been named as potential suspects. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest enigmas. But by examining the evidence, the methods, and the psychological profile of the killer, we can narrow the list down to the most compelling candidates. Today, we're stepping back in time to the dark streets of Victorian London. We will analyze the evidence against the top 3 historical suspects, sifting through clues and contradictions to see if we can shed light on this century-old cold case. Who was the man behind the legend? Our first suspect is a man whose name is almost as famous as the Ripper's himself, Montague John Druitt. Born into a respectable family, Druitt was a barrister and an assistant schoolmaster in Blackheath, a man who seemed the epitome of a Victorian gentleman. On the surface, he appeared to lead a successful life. He was educated at Winchester College and Oxford University, excelling in both academics and sports. Yet, beneath this polished exterior, a darker reality was unfolding. At the end of November 1888, just after the last confirmed Ripper murder, Druitt was abruptly dismissed from his teaching position. The reasons for his dismissal remain obscure, with some sources suggesting he was in serious trouble. Just weeks later, on December 31, 1888, his body was pulled from the River Thames. His pockets were filled with stones, and a note found on his person spoke of a fear that he was going to be like Mother, alluding to his family's history of mental health struggles. The timing is what makes Druitt a prime suspect. The Ripper murders ceased abruptly after the death of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9. Druitt's disappearance and subsequent death a few weeks later provide a convenient and tidy explanation for why the killings stopped. One of the highest-ranking police officials at the time, Sir Melville Macnaghten, named Druitt as his preferred suspect in a private memorandum written in 1894. Macnaghten believed that Druitt's own family suspected him of being the Ripper and that his death was a final, desperate act of a guilty conscience. However, the case against Druitt is far from concrete. There is no direct evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes. His home in Blackheath was miles away from Whitechapel, and as a barrister and schoolmaster, it's questionable whether he possessed the anatomical knowledge displayed by the killer. Furthermore, his alibi for at least one of the murders seems solid. On the night of a double murder, he was reportedly playing cricket in Dorset, far from the blood-soaked streets of London. Was Druitt a tormented soul who took his own life, or was he the infamous killer, his watery grave forever sealing his dark secret? Next, we turn our attention to a suspect whose profession and location place him squarely in the heart of the Whitechapel terror, Soren Klusowski, better known by his alias, George Chapman. A Polish immigrant who arrived in London around 1888, Chapman worked as a barber surgeon in Whitechapel, a trade that gave him access to sharp instruments and a basic understanding of anatomy. Chapman lived and worked in the very area where the Ripper's victims were found. His timeline in London aligns perfectly with the murder spree. He arrived shortly before the killings began and lived in the district throughout the entire period. He was known to have a violent and misogynistic nature. He was a serial philanderer who was notoriously cruel to the women in his life. His most damning legacy, however, came years after the Ripper had vanished from the headlines. Chapman was eventually arrested, not for street violence, but for a more insidious crime. He was found guilty of poisoning 3 of his mistresses to death with antimony, a slow and agonizing method. He was convicted and executed in 1903. During his trial, Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of the lead investigators on the original Ripper case, reportedly told the officer who arrested Chapman, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Aberline was convinced that Chapman was the man they had been hunting for years. The psychological profile fits. A serial killer who targets women, a known misogynist, and someone capable of calculated, cold-blooded murder. The transition from brutal, hands-on killings to the more detached method of poisoning could be seen as an evolution in his criminal behavior, a way to continue his spree with less risk. But there is a significant counterargument. The Ripper's method was one of frenzied, explosive violence, a stark contrast to the slow, methodical poisoning that was Chapman's signature. Criminologists and profilers have long debated whether a killer would make such a drastic change in their modus operandi. Could a man driven by rage to mutilate his victims on the street suddenly switch to the patient, passive act of poisoning? While his proximity, profession, and later crimes make him a compelling suspect, this fundamental difference in method leaves a shadow of doubt. Was George Chapman the Ripper, or just another monster who happened to walk the same streets? This brings us to our third and perhaps most intriguing suspect, Aaron Kosminski. Like Chapman, Kosminski was a Polish immigrant who lived in the heart of Whitechapel. He worked as a hairdresser, a humble profession that masked a deeply troubled mind. Kosminski suffered from severe mental illness. His condition deteriorated over time, and he was eventually institutionalized in an asylum in 1891. His medical records describe him as paranoid, delusional, and harboring a homicidal tendency. He experienced auditory hallucinations and reportedly had a deep-seated hatred of women, particularly those he considered immoral. This psychological profile aligns chillingly with what modern profilers believe motivated the Ripper, a deep-seated rage and misogyny, likely fueled by psychotic delusions. Like Montague Druitt, Kosminski was named as a prime suspect by Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten in his 1894 memo. Macnaghten noted that Kosminski had a great hatred of women, with strong homicidal tendencies. He also believed that Kosminski was identified by a witness, but that the witness, who was also Jewish, refused to testify against a fellow Jew. The timing of Kosminski's institutionalization is also significant. He was committed to the Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum shortly after the murder spree ended. This offers another potential explanation for why the killings stopped so suddenly. The killer was no longer on the streets but locked away. In recent years, the case for Kosminski has been bolstered by a controversial piece of evidence. A shawl, allegedly found near the body of victim Catherine Eddowes, was subjected to DNA analysis. The author of the study claimed to have found a mitochondrial DNA match between samples from the shawl and living descendants of both Eddowes and Kosminski. However, this DNA evidence has been heavily criticized by the scientific community for its methodology and potential for contamination. The shawl's origins are also disputed, with no official record of it being collected from the crime scene. Without verifiable provenance and peer-reviewed DNA results, the shawl remains a tantalizing but unproven link. Was Aaron Kosminski a man whose tortured mind exploded into a spree of unimaginable violence before he was finally removed from society? Or is he simply another tragic figure whose mental illness made him an easy scapegoat in the desperate search for a killer? 3 men, 3 very different lives, all connected by suspicion to the same shadowy legend. Montague Druitt, the respectable barrister whose timely death ended the reign of terror. George Chapman, the barber surgeon and convicted poisoner who stalked the same streets as the Ripper. And Aaron Kosminski, the mentally ill hairdresser whose inner demons may have driven him to commit the ultimate sin. The truth is, we may never know for certain who Jack the Ripper was. The physical evidence is long gone, the witnesses are dust, and the streets of Whitechapel have changed beyond recognition. The killer's identity is a secret that London has kept for over a century. The case leaves us with more questions than answers. It forces us to confront the darkness that can hide behind a veneer of civility, in the heart of a bustling city, or within the fragile confines of the human mind. The Ripper remains a ghost, a phantom forever etched into the pages of criminal history. What do you think? Which of these suspects seems the most likely culprit, or do you believe the real killer was someone else entirely? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of history's greatest mysteries, make sure to subscribe to Facts Repo. We have plenty more stories to uncover.